Well, students, today I have with me as my very special guest the President of the Human Rights Commission in Australia, Gillian Triggs. Gillian, thanks for joining me.
It's a great pleasure to be here.
Well, you are President of the Human Rights Commission. First of all, can you tell our students what the Human Rights Commission is, what it does, and indeed what the role of the President is?
Well, it's a very unusual body because we're set up by the government, but we're set up under a special statute that guarantees our independence from government. So it's an odd thing to sort of get your head around. But basically, we're given a very important mandate, and that is to call the government and the private sector to account, to comply with the international human rights treaties to which Australia is a party, and also to comply with the anti-discrimination laws that we have in Australia on race, sex, disability, and age. So we have a role as advocates. As President, I can call an inquiry if I choose to, and take evidence under oath. But perhaps one of the most important but least known aspects of what we do is that we receive about 23,000 complaints a year. And what happens is that people can come to us without cost, and we investigate the complaint and we try to conciliate it. And we do conciliate about 72% of those matters. Only if you come to us first can you then go on, if you're not happy, to the federal court. So we're a sort of gatekeeper, in a way, for those human rights questions and anti-discrimination law issues before you can get to the federal court. And the reason I'm very proud of that part of the service is that it really is a genuine access to justice for a very high number of Australians who in reality would never be going to the court, would not be consulting lawyers, but they have got a genuine concern about human rights. Now, my job as President is basically to make sure all of that goes along smoothly, and I do make the final findings and recommendations on all of those complaints. But I also work with my colleagues who are commissioners within the Commission on sex, children, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islanders, on race, on age and disability. So we've got a range of people with very particular portfolios, but my job as President is really to make sure it all works, and I'm often the front person indeed on very sensitive political questions, particularly asylum seekers.
Well, Gillian, prior to taking on this gig, you'd built up a reputation in international law, in academia. In fact, you were Dean of the Law School at Sydney University. Can you give students an insight, I guess, as to how law was taught when you're at law school compared to the skills that are now required by students to practice law in a modern environment?
Well, it's very, very different. I, of course, went to law school in the early 60s, and law was very much taught on the basis of a massive lecture theatre of 320 students, often in the chemistry theatre for some reason, I'm not quite sure why. At the University of Melbourne, and the lecturer would come in at 5 past the hour and talk for 50 minutes until 5 to the hour, and then we'd all pack up our books and go away again. There was very little opportunity for any interaction, very rarely, and we were literally taught the jurisprudence of the law by wonderful teachers, I'd have to say, wonderful lecturers. But it was, this is the law on contracts, point number one, point number two, and that's pretty much how it went. So I'm afraid we did get very bored. And it was only in the tutorials where you had any sort of opportunity. By contrast, fast forward more than 50 years, you're dealing in an environment where you've got smaller groups and where you're learning through engaging with your teachers, but also learning by doing much more. And so you're actually going to the courts, going to agencies that deal with mental health or juveniles in detention or asylum seekers or whatever the issue is. You've got a much clearer sense of just what the law actually means in practice. And this is really what younger people are asking for. Of course, coming from my background, I see a very great value in the jurisprudence of the law. I love to read the cases, love to read the statutes. But of course I do, particularly in my current position, understand that one of the most important skills of a lawyer is to be able to translate that law into something that's meaningful for people to ensure justice and equity, which is really why, or at least one of the better reasons for becoming a lawyer.
So how do you find going from the theory of the law as a law student and even in the world of academia to your current job where you can see almost on a daily basis how implementation of the law can actually fail the most vulnerable of our citizens?
Well, that is in a way one of the great disappointments because I'm somebody who really did learn to love the law, and a lot of my own life has been either working in academia or with a major law firm or in research institutes, so I've really learned to love the law. But in this job, really towards the end of my career, I've actually observed the very great gulf between the law that's affordable by relatively wealthy people, and typically the business community, and the law that is not available to really the overwhelming majority of Australians. Now, in many cases, perhaps that's not a problem, but it is for the most vulnerable in our community. And for those who will never go and see a lawyer, they often wouldn't even recognise that they've got a legal problem, but they certainly couldn't afford legal fees. And it's very, very difficult to deliver legal justice to them. But also, quite beyond the question of access to justice, is that the law as it's applied can be applied in a way which delivers injustice or promotes pockets within our communities of vulnerability and injustice. And that is very distressing when you can identify that it's there, but find that there's not always the political will to resolve it. And that is, I think, one of the great challenges. We have a rule of law-based system. We're in a democracy. We have a relatively open parliamentary system, but it's still very difficult to engage lawmakers with the practical implementation of those laws to protect the most vulnerable in our communities.
Okay, so as President of the Human Rights Commission, you are or at least have the potential to be at the forefront of law reform. How resilient do you have to be when you're in the law reform business?
Well, quite resilient in the sense of sticking to your guns. There will be many who will stand up against reform. Lawyers, of course, are almost instinctively a conservative profession. That's what we do. We apply the law by reference to the past and past examples, and it's not always easy to encourage some reform thinking. I think it's a wonderful thing to be engaged with. If you've got the evidence to support the need for reform, then it's easier to draw people along to adopt a reform agenda. And of course, reform should be cautious and it should be based on evidence. But I think that is the great challenge for the profession today, and that is to understand where law is failing and where that law needs to be reformed.
Well, talking about resilience, your groundbreaking Forgotten Children report put you under enormous public pressure. In fact, there were calls for you to resign. What sort of personal and professional toll did that take on you?
Well, of course, it was very hurtful and damaging. But I'd have to say that my best friend, in a sense, was the law. Because when we embarked on that report, we made certain that we had the law right and that we had the evidence to back the findings and recommendations. So although there were personal attacks, in a way that was almost an indication that there was no substantive basis on which to attack the report. And it was the report and the children in detention that we were mainly concerned about. So I think perhaps it's a form of resilience, perhaps it's because in the end you're a lawyer and you rely on your skills as a lawyer that sort of got us through. And since then, of course, we know that the findings have been replicated and continue to be replicated by all those that visit the children in detention, now particularly, of course, on Nauru. So in that sense, we're vindicated. But vindication is not really what this is about. It's about making sure that you're straight about what you're doing. You've got the law right, you've got the evidence to back what you're doing, and you're making a point, you're making a proposition. Others may disagree, but one has, as a lawyer, to have the perhaps the resilience, to use your word, or at least the determination that you'll stand by your arguments unless you can be demonstrated to have got it wrong somewhere.
So did you ever think as a law student all those years ago that you would actually, and I guess it is a privilege, have the privilege to visit places where you see firsthand the inhumane treatment that people are dishing out to their fellow human beings, and what impact has that had on your career?
Well, I think perhaps the first thing that I really noticed when I took on this job is that it's a national job, it's a national role, and most of us work within our law firms or in the courts or with government, maybe the NGO sector or a university. But to take this position on, you're actually moving across the whole of Australia. So I would go to aged care facilities, several hours drive out of Katherine, where people who've been stockmen, Indigenous, worn out by their jobs, now being looked after beautifully in aged care facilities. Go down another hour down that yellow dusty road and you find a deeply impoverished, disadvantaged community. That is really a shame, a shameful observation for Australia to allow this to occur. So I saw enormous extremes from Christmas Island to Tasmania, Cairns, to Darwin. I felt enormously proud to be Australian and to see as a country what we are trying to achieve at the national level. But I also saw with despair some of the issues that we turn a blind eye to. And I think we need a greater spotlight on managing those situations. One that came up and is always despairing is to see that nearly 50% of young people held in juvenile detention facilities are Indigenous. And that must tell Australia there's something very, very badly going wrong. Or you see, old people subject to abuse of various kinds. We don't like to admit that these things happen in our society, but they do exist. And so that's been, as you say, partly a privilege to have an insight into those circumstances that I would never otherwise have been aware of. I might have read about them, but to actually see them and to meet the people affected by these policies is sobering, and indeed makes one even more determined to bring these things into the light.
Well, our students were thrilled to learn recently that you've agreed to chair the JD Advisory Board here at RMIT. Why did you agree to take that position up?
Well, partly because I'm a great fan of the JD. It is a degree that you can do, of course, when you've finished your undergraduate degree, where you may not have had either the money or experience or opportunity to do a law degree. The JD offers that opportunity, and I think that's a wonderful thing, that you can actually come at the JD a few years further down the track, and their law is open to you as a career. The other is that I do think that this JD at RMIT is a very exciting one. It has an emphasis on the practical and an emphasis on social justice. So in a way, the JD here at RMIT is offering the very things that I've learnt relatively late in my career are actually so important to being a good lawyer, whether you do that at the top end of the town law firm, or you with a civil society working for government, or in business, or you become an artist or a poetry writer. It doesn't matter. You bring those skills and a sense of social justice to whatever you do to your career after that.
Silly me, I thought you only came because I was associated with the course. But
that was very important.
So last question. If you had one piece of advice to give to our students, knowing the career that you've had, in law, academia, and now President of the Human Rights Commission, what would that piece of advice be?
I think it would be to take every advantage you possibly can of the time you've got studying for that degree, because you may never again in your life have that opportunity to question your lecturers, to talk to your colleagues who are going to be your colleagues for the rest of your professional life. So I'd say really enjoy and absorb all of those opportunities. Because those 3 years, it's a 3-year degree, those 3 years possibly will never come again, and it's a wonderful opportunity to learn the craft and the skills of your profession and to absorb it all. So I think that would be my advice.
Well, there you go, students. Some great advice. Grasp every opportunity that's made available to you during the course, and there are plenty of them on offer at RMIT. JD at RMIT is the place to be. Thanks for joining me.